about the medical side of things more, I think one of the issues when players do get injured, what we don't want to try and create is for things to become recurrent. So we need to try and get to the bottom of whatever the problem is. And I think that goes hand in hand with getting a really good accurate diagnosis, good early accurate diagnosis, which I think now with the development of scans and using ultrasound on a more regular basis with the medics, we get that information much better. And I think it allows us to monitor healing processes and healing tissues through a sputum injury. So really, when they're going back onto the battlefield, they can withstand, or that injured part can withstand the rigours, and it doesn't become a recurrence. I think that's an important aspect.
Moving on sort of from that, with your experience obviously with European and Champions League football alongside the Premiership season, and Chris, with you for major competitions with England, how important is recovery, and how do you manage your recovery to actually improve their resilience and reduce their exposure to potential injury?
I think recovery starts as soon as you finish the game. I think it's a vital aspect to being able to perform for the next game. I think Sir Alex Ferguson always used to be such an advocate of rest at the right times, and I think once you're in those the environment of playing games at weekends and midweek, you basically do very little training. It's a case of recovering and getting ready again to go again. So I think that it's a big part of things, really, big part.
Yeah, I think to add to that, from a physical perspective, when you're at a major tournament, you're playing every 4 to 5 days, so recovery is critical. You're quite often in a city that you're not based at, so you're flying back after games to your base city. So recovery becomes critical, and at the European Championships in France, we had strategies, as Neil just said, within the first half an hour of the game finishing, then within the first hour of the game finishing, and then within the 24 hours after the game finished. So we had different elements that the player should concentrate on in that period. Quite often the three real key elements for us were food, drink and sleep, or rest. They were the three biggest parts for us to concentrate on, and then everything else that goes around that: pool recovery, cryotherapies and massages, etc. But they were the three sort of key elements to us. They were obviously available in the dressing room straight after the game, so we could make sure players are drinking and eating, and then putting different strategies in place to make sure rest and recovery and sleep was as well as it could be.
Obviously, one of the things we've talked about again is the amount of data that gets produced on a daily basis, and certain clubs do far more testing than others. And it's what's your opinion on the amount of data that's being produced? Because obviously at an exhibition like this, there are a lot of people trying to sell a lot of different tools that they believe would make a difference to your players. What's your opinion on the amount of data and how you use it?
I think that's just it, Nick. I think it's just how you use it. I think everything has a place, and I think it's some of the technologies that we've got have been fantastically insightful and have come on leaps and bounds over the last 10, 15 years, and have been really, really insightful and useful. But I think it is just down to the individual club and the individual people within the clubs and how you use those and whether they influence your practice, and that will change from club to club.
You mentioned earlier on when we were talking beforehand about a championship club at the moment the kind of data they collect. Can you just kind of expand as to what type of data certain clubs do use?
Yeah, so I mean there are clubs that will do movement screens every day. They'll do blood tests every day, urine tests every day, saliva tests every day, and subjective analysis every day, and which is fine. If it has an impact on your practices and how it works, then great. And if it has an impact on how you develop and form your training programs, then absolutely fine. But it's a lot of data.
Again, I think take a bit more of a pragmatic approach. Really, I think we do all this data collection and movement analysis, and there's so many different ways to move, and there's people find their own way of moving. So we know what perhaps is the ideal, but sometimes there's variance away from that. So I think we have to be flexible in an approach to when we are. And for me to do movement screens every day, I think would just blow your mind.
With that in mind, though, I mean, what type of key indicators do you use at Man United? What gets done on a regular basis, and what do you find most useful for you as the team physio?
We would look at the flexibility, the ability of soft tissues to extend. I think in a period where they're underprepared or not recovered, players don't move as well or aren't flexible as they should be. So you can do that at different muscle components, different ranges of movement. I think muscle control, particularly around the knee, is key. But again, having said that, that can come from different aspects of foot biomechanics and things like that. So it's mainly, I think, the flexibility on a day-to-day basis is the key one.
And which of the kind of medical and sports science teams, if you kind of mention the people that you rely upon to give you feedback about how resilient a player is. So obviously we're sports and exercise scientists and physios, so we're kind of obvious. What other members of the team are important in that decision-making process on resilience on players?
I think more recently sports psychologists have come into the field and come into the game. And obviously they're giving us a different sort of tack on mental strength and mental resilience. It's perhaps something that I know Sir Alex Ferguson always used to say he was the psychologist. He was the psychologist in the club, and he was and to be fair to him, he probably was the best psychologist he's ever lived, really. So in his time, he sort of read into different things and worked out situations and was able to speak to people in a different way. And so these skills that he developed over the years were massive. Now, obviously now we've got different professionals coming in and they have different inputs. We also have just sort of creating a player welfare department to try and prepare the players, not so much the first team players, because the first team players have a group of people around them, their agents and everybody that sort of look after all their needs, but some of the younger players who perhaps depend on their social backgrounds need support in everyday activities and need to learn how to live, and I think that perhaps allows them to become a little bit more resilient, so they're not having to worry about things outside of the club if they know how to deal with things like that.
I think at the clubs now, we've got chefs, we've got kitmen, you've got everybody that the players need, in addition to the practitioners and the specialists that are working with them on a day-to-day basis. You've got people that will pick up different things. They look at things from a slightly different perspective, and they can be invaluable. Those little tidbits of information sometimes can be invaluable that come from a source that you've never really considered. So quite often you can kind of build up a bigger picture of somebody through information that we, through our formal processes, wouldn't necessarily pick up. So I think that's another element to it.
I think again with the academy, I think as we become older and a little bit more experienced, we're all parents, so I think that gives you an insight in sometimes that I think some of the 18, certainly the 18, or the under 18s, 16 to 18 year olds are just so emotionally immature, and as far as their decision making and their reactions to certain situations, and I think I know now that I'm able to give them a different insight, different advice into what I did 25 years ago when I first came into the job.
We were talking about before, it's been a long time that Neil and I have sort of known each other from reserve team and first team, and the game's entirely different from what it was when we first started. Given that obviously the transfer window has only just closed, how much does mental or resilience come into a pre-signing medical? And obviously when it's last minute, just to try and get medicals done. Do you do, as part of a pre-signing medical, any kind of resilience measure, or what's important to you?
As per se, as far as the signing medical, I don't think we do tend to. They tend to be, a lot of the time, tend to be rushed through. But we do now do cognitive testing for head injury measurement. So when a player gets a head injury, we have a baseline test, and then they redo the test after the head injury to give us some sort of idea of how significant it is. But I think probably on the recruitment side, and again, I know, going back to Sir Alex, he used to know all sorts of background on players that we were signing and make decisions on people in that way. So he used to do his own research. I don't know how much of the recruitment department do on that side of things now. I wouldn't know.
I think from our side, we're very much guided by the medics and their orthopaedic assessments they'll do with players as we're signing. It depends on the club that they come from. Quite often we'll have historic relationships with the club. If we're signing somebody from another club where we can ring them up and we can get information if they're signed for us. Quite often we can ring and get information on their history, their medical history, their test results, for example, which helps us just build from a sports science perspective, build a picture quite quickly of what they're like. They've worked at a club maybe for the last 8 years. We can find out a lot of information from the club. So and quite often clubs are very forthcoming if we sign somebody on that information. So maybe not at United's level, but.
And really, just for us to sort of round up a little bit, do you have any sort of opinion on what you would believe would be the future of sort of resilience training? Is there any measures you'd like to be able to do that you can't currently do, or information you'd like to find out about people?
I think from a physical perspective, I think understanding a little bit more about what's happening internally as opposed to just externally. A lot of our monitoring tools are external load factors and external load monitoring. So GPS, for example, we know how fast somebody's run, but we don't necessarily know how those relevant muscles have reacted to that run. So understanding a little bit more through maybe surface EMG, that kind of thing, where we can get a little bit more understanding of how the muscles are reacting to the external stimulus would be useful. And whether that's out on the field or whether that's in the gym, most of what we collect at the moment is externally monitored rather than internally. So we've got cardiac load, of course, with heart rate monitoring, but knowing what muscles are doing would be much more useful, or as useful.
I think, like I said earlier, I think it would be nice to have a shift into perhaps, certainly in the academy players or the younger age groups, more of a multi-sport environment. I think that would be beneficial for movement skills.
So even within an academy, playing different sports under the heading of Man United Football Club, you'd be able to participate in a number of different sports, and you feel that would benefit Man United in the long term because of the movement patterns that would be developed.
Yeah, I think we've thrown this idea around for a long time, but it's just the difficulty is the coaching or our coaching group or coaching teams allowing you to do that sort of aspect of things. I think it's difficult.
I mean, often professional contracts limit people from doing other sports deliberately for that they don't want to open them up to a risk of something different. So would you advocate that as well, Chris? You'd want people to do a variety of different sports?
Yeah, I think, like Neil says, I think it's important moving forward that we kind of allow young people to gain a variety of skills and movement competency, and quite often you can do that with incorporating a lot of different sports, a lot of different movement patterns.
And I think also there's a lot of different research going on at the moment about different aspects of assessment or testing, whether that be physical or psychological, that then may yield some results, or maybe even it will disprove that all the data we're collecting is valuable or is relevant. So from us, really, we're sort of wrapping up towards now. Is there any questions or anything at all?
Thanks, gents. That was a really insightful discussion. I hate to be the one to try and play devil's advocate, but I agree with everything that you said. But when we talk about multi-sport and movement skills, and we think of Ronaldinho and Coutinho and Suarez and people like that who have grown up in impoverished areas, probably playing thousands of hours on concrete, never doing a single leg squat in their life, to consider how much valgus they've got at the knee. How important do you really think any of this is? Do you think that those guys are genetic top of the pyramids, and you know that for every Coutinho there's another 2 million Brazilians who can't do anything? Or do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I think culturally, you know, you're talking about different systems, different countries, and obviously, you know, different countries or different places have different exposures, if you like, to different things. Brazil, for example, I don't know, a lot of beach resorts, players play on beaches and sand and everything else. And even though they play football, do they always play on, you know, concrete and so on? You know, this country, we've been talking about the recruitment process of players in this country. I think what we're talking about is the changes. It's not so much what we do now, but it's the changes over the last sort of 10, 15, 20 years. I went to a conference a couple of months ago, and one of Neil's colleagues was talking about Wayne Rooney probably being the last of a certain generation of you know, lads that were brought up playing football in the street, whereas most players now that are coming through the academy system, as Neil said, are straight into a formal system, if you like, and that's where the majority of their football is coming from. So I think it depends where you come from, it depends what exposures you've had. I think from our perspective in this country, then probably exposure to other things would help, whether that other things is, you know, gymnastics or climbing walls, or then I don't see it can be a bad thing. But you know, I think early specialisation can be right for one, Ronaldo, but might not be right for everybody.
Yeah, I think those sort of players that you named would have come through in whatever system you put in place. But I think probably coming from where they come from, the players that you named, that will create a resilience in them physically and mentally. And I think that's what we see is the top players that get there have that innate. But then if you look at somebody like Marcus Rashford now, who's come through our academy, and you know, he's still probably not quite at their level yet, but he potentially can be. So I think the top players will get there, whatever. But I think it's what happens with the others in the system, the thousands of others that either get so far and then don't quite get there, whether we equip them for other things or whether doing other things would get them there. I don't know. It's difficult to. I don't know how many more players are less resilient now than what they were 20 years ago, which is so difficult to quantify, really.
I think, sort of to go with your point there, I think one of the things that those types of players did is they played with freedom. They just played. They weren't being coached all those hours. It was rough and ready, and that's kind of what Chris and Neil have touched on particularly before. You know, as an age group, we were riding bikes and falling off trees and all the rest of it. But when they're not allowed to now because they're in an academy system, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And I think the players you mentioned, it's not necessarily about playing football. It's about having the freedom to make mistakes and get your knocks and come back from it, and that's what builds the resilience and the movement plans.
Hi. Probably a bit directed at you because we've both been in around 18 years, and my field is in recovery. I think what I come across a lot more than I ever have done in that period of time is, would you consider that the mental resilience of players these days is, if not as important, if not more important than the physical side of things in modern sport today?
I think they go hand in hand. I don't think you can really say one's more important than the other. Somebody who perhaps is physically resilient might not have the same mental resilience as another player who's very mentally resilient but perhaps physically isn't as, you know, I think there's different components and different ratings on all that in individuals, and I think that's the difficult thing with all this, that there's just so many variables from person to person. I think the mental resilience is key. I think that the amount of pressure that's on players, certainly at our level, to perform constantly is massive. I think they have media, they have so much, you know, social media, they have TV, they have interviews, they have everything to sort of consider, you know, and I think that will affect certain people massively. I think they need to be able to deal with all that sort of side of things mentally. That's, you know, it is difficult, really difficult.
There's a lot of debate about load, as you say. So you've got Alan Pardew said his medical department was too protective, he felt, when he was at Palace, particularly in pre-season. Raymond Verheyen's very outspoken about it. And then you've got Tim Gabbert saying you should push players to high loads safely. What do you think about that? Where do you stand on that?
As I said, I think it's us to be able to manage it is really important. But how you define it is less so clear. I think there's different definitions of load, in inverted commas, and that can be from cardiac load to running load to gym load to psychological load. And I think some are easier to monitor than others and to put numbers against. I think one thing we touched on a little bit is psychological load and psychological recovery. It's a really important aspect, but how do we manage that and how do we monitor it? How do we put a number against it? It's very difficult. So I think it depends on the load you're talking about, and you know, I know, you know, Tim's work has been really useful, and you know, I think we can train, but it's making sure that the peaks and the troughs are not too big. I think that's the bottom line, whatever the variable is that you choose, and to make sure that a player is graded into or out of a certain load. So we were talking earlier, it's a different sport, we were talking earlier about Andrew Murray. If you remember when Andy Murray came into tennis, he was getting to later stages of tournaments, he was struggling a little bit physically and possibly mentally as well, because the demands were that much higher and we just weren't used to it. But of course he's pretty robust and resilient to later stages of tournaments now as he's got older, and his training obviously has become better, and he's become more robust to it. So I certainly think it's got a place. You know, we should be monitoring, we should be trying to manage it, but sometimes depending on the variable you use, it's harder to define.
I think it's different for individuals as well. I think it's easy to say train harder. We're in a team sport, but within the team there's a lot of individuals, and different individuals can cope with different loads and different aspects. So I think it's being mindful of that as well, really.
You collect and amass this huge amount of data on all these different individuals. How much of it do you make available to each player? And is there a risk of creating a sort of paranoid athlete who might think, I've got all this data, you know, I'm at risk of doing this, I'm apprehensive of doing this? Is that a potential issue?
Yeah, I think that happens. Yeah. I think it's ultimately the players' data, so I think they do have access to it. How much they take in is different again with individuals, and you have the glass half empty individuals, and you've got the glass half full individuals. You know, and it's a very difficult situation to manage with certain characters. Yeah.
I think it depends on the way you're working. I think it depends on the philosophy of the club and the coaching staff and the manager and so on. If they don't want something to be measured, because they don't want the player to necessarily know that we don't measure it. Other things we might take, if there's quite an open policy, then I think it's an education process, and that's for us. as practitioners to make sure the players are educated to know why we're collecting what we're collecting and what impact it potentially has. So I think it's a bit of a twofold thing really. Some clubs will go down one route and won't collect a lot because they don't want to collect a lot, and others will collect quite a lot of data. As long as you use that data and it's a transparent policy and the players understand.
Okay, from our point of view, just as I'd say thank you for attending. Thanks to Chris and to Neil for all of their insights. As we said before, we're part of the Football Medical Association. The stand's just here. Lindsay will be there in a minute, and she loves meeting new people. So if you want to find out a little bit more about the organisation and how we kind of represent a lot of the sports science and medical staff, a little bit of information. But thank you very much for your time.